Welcome back to the second part of our overview of the German home front during World War One. In the first part, we took a look at how Germany was operating at the beginning of the war, but we now need to start exploring a little bit more about what the German government did as the war went on. Now, it's important to understand that the German government had to raise funds to pay for the war effort. And unlike Britain and France, which had access to international markets, particularly American money, Germany, for the most part, was forced to raise money internally. It didn't have any strong friends to rely on to give it cash. So the main way that it actually raised money was through what's called the war bonds, or the Kriegsanleihe. You can see here Kriegsanleihe. So it's the war loan or the war bonds. And it's effectively a loan. Industries, businesses and civilians, everyday people, are asked to give money to the government as a loan. And in return, in 10 years' time, they would get the money back with interest. So you're investing in your country. And there's a lot of war bond drives that took place in Germany during the First World War. And each one is accompanied by a lot of propaganda, of course, in order to encourage people to contribute to the war loan. And on the screen, I've got a number of posters here, some of them from later in the war. We can tell this one's later in the war just by the clothing and the accessories of the German soldier. But we see these, they're all numbered. This one's war loan drive number 8. They're each numbered and attempt to get people to invest in Germany, invest in the war effort. Different types of imagery used. We can see here the St. George slaying the dragon kind of approach. So we've often seen this knight sort of approach in the German propaganda. Here it's slaying the beast. Obviously that's intended to be Britain. And this one, just pulling on your heartstrings a little bit more to support the soldiers that were at the German front. Here's a couple more posters from later in the war. This one from 1918. And you can see there the man basically standing there defending the vulnerable woman and child. And that's what you're doing. Even if you're at home, you can help to guard your happiness, guard the ones that you love by contributing to the war loan. And this one from 1917 on the right is actually using the new leader, Hindenburg, as the face to try to, get support, get people to support the war loan. It's interesting here, as we'll learn, by 1917, this poster is reflecting times are hard. But the poster is saying victory is near. All you need to do is contribute money to the war loan to keep the effort going. So about 2/3 of German war expenditure was actually raised through war bonds, which is an incredible amount of money, and mostly contributed, of course, by companies and institutions such as banks, but also everyday people, particularly earlier on in the war, would contribute to these war loans. Unfortunately, though, for Germany, things did continue to get worse and worse on the home front as the war progressed. So by the middle of 1916, things were quite harsh. When we think about what's happening in 1916 on the battlefronts, we've got the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme, and certainly the massive casualties experienced by the German army at both of those battles started to undermine that strong, positive patriotism for the war. But what's happening on the home front also exacerbated the deepening concern about what was happening, because there were really falling conditions on the home front. And these came from a number of different factors, including the continuing naval blockade, which was stopping the importation of necessary products into Germany. But also there was a poor harvest in 1915. So the agricultural output was dropping, and we had a shorter supply of basic goods, things like potatoes, wheat, meat, dairy products. These become in short supply in Germany by 1916. What this means is that what food there is available is more expensive. So we see a doubling of food prices and a dramatic increase in the cost of living that has a direct impact on the social conditions of the civilians on the home front. We can see here a photograph of civilians queuing for food. Also here in these pictures, we can see soup kitchens, often done by volunteers and selling soup. You can see here 35 pfennigs, so it wasn't free, but it was cheap, and it was actually being put together and taken out onto the streets by cart and being sold in the streets in Berlin. With the massive increase in prices, many local authorities did try to actually control the prices, keep it under control. But in those areas where controls were put in place, local farmers who, needed to support themselves as well, merely just, went to another neighbouring region and sold it there for a higher price. Bread was rationed from 1915 onwards, and much more widespread rationing was introduced in May 1916. So there were 258 laws controlling the supply, distribution and consumption of food. Now, with such a control and a limited supply of food, what we see developing in Germany very strongly is the black market. So a black market, of course, is where people have goods and they're selling them outside of the controlled prices, outside of the government regulation. And because there is such a need, people are willing to pay for it. And so the prices increase even more. Country people were a little bit better off than those in the city, because in the country you could go out into the forest, you could hunt for game, you could grow some of your own agricultural products, even if it's as simple as a lettuce or some potatoes for yourself. What that meant is that the urban poor were really the worst affected by the food shortages. And we see the city dwellers in particular having to spend a large amount of time queuing for food, and we do see food riots also break out in the cities. By 1916, thousands of Berliners were dependent on the soup kitchens, which we've shown in these photographs. In 1916, we also see a change in government. Now, as the war has progressed, you recall that we showed the Kaiser as the autocrat completely in charge of the German government. But as the war went on, the generals, the army, started to have a greater say, and it became clear that the Kaiser really didn't have the skills to lead the country during war. And this becomes really obvious in August 1916, when Hindenburg and his Officer Ludendorff take control of the German army. And they not only take control of the military, but also control of the home front. And really we see the Kaiser not making a lot of decisions from this point onwards. He's still there. He still is the Kaiser. He's still a figurehead. But certainly the decision making is now being very much controlled by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. One of the programs that they initiated in 1916 is called the Hindenburg Program. And it's interesting to note that it's really in, the second half of 1916 that we see the German government seizing even greater control of the economy in order to make it work more effectively to support the war front. And we see the same thing happening in Britain. Remember, it's late 1916 that Lloyd George takes control in Britain and really starts to have a much heavier hand in controlling industry within Britain. And the same is happening in Germany. One of the real problems that Germany was suffering from was a short supply of labour in key industries like munitions, and it just hadn't been organised well enough. Men obviously had been conscripted, gone off to the front line, but industry hadn't really been managed to ensure that the labour supply, the labour in those key areas had actually been backfilled. So in 1916, we see the creation of the Supreme War Office, the Kriegsamt, and it is aiming to control civilian labour. manufacturing industries, and transport industries in particular. And while the initial laws were aimed at men aged 17 to 60, very, very soon it increases because it realises that there's not a lot of men in that age group left to actually control. And so they expand their control, and now they are managing the labour of men, all men, women, juveniles, so teenagers, disabled servicemen who've been sent back from the war, and also prisoners of war, whether they be Russians or British, who have been captured on the front lines and sent back into Germany as prisoners of war. So they are really, in 1916, starting to really control the labour forces and make them work much better for the total war effort. And we can talk about serving the fatherland. This is the way they refer to it in Germany. Women in particular became a really important part of the labour force, just as we saw happening in Britain, and particularly to keep the munitions factories running. We've got a few photographs here which show us, a state munitions factory, and all of the, most of the people pictured here are women, although we do have still male in the background there. Then this photograph here, which is taken in 1917 of a group of munitions workers, all of them except one being female. We have to understand, however, that while women were an extremely important part, they were being paid less than 50% of men's wages. So it was actually costing those employers less than it would have if they had male labourers. Other measures that the government introduced as part of this Hindenburg program to better control industry were things like introducing work on Sundays and also closing down universities and training colleges. And what that meant is that the young men were either encouraged to go off to war or work in the factories in order to support the war effort. Things like education were pretty much being put on hold until victory could be achieved in the war. So the Hindenburg program overall aimed to double munitions production. And it did do this. It was very effective at garnering, getting the munitions industry back under control. But what this focus did was neglected other key industries, particularly things that affected civilians like agriculture, which didn't increase the food supply at all, and also civilian transport and delivery of coal for civilian purposes. Now you might think, not such a big deal, but you've got to remember that when you go into wintertime in Europe, people are absolutely dependent on coal to heat their houses. And without the heating, they can, start to die from exposure. And this kind of thing does start to really impact on the German home front as time goes on. We might end this part here, and we'll come back in the final part to see how things really start to make a turn for the worse as we head into 1917 and 1918 for Germany.